Well, happy Wednesday. Thanks for watching. It's June 10th, and I want to thank you for taking 5 to 7 minutes and watching this leadership thought I have as we continue to all grow as leaders in the church, as we continue to learn. Ultimately, we want to learn from Christ, and we want to be able to be a servant like Jesus and learn from the greatest example and the greatest leader to ever live, which was Jesus Christ. We're using this book, and it's called To Lead Like Jesus by Blanchard. This is going to be the last week that we use his content. I'm reading through another book, and I'll introduce that next week, and it will be the starting point for a leadership discussion for the next 5 to 7 minutes. So, again, I want to encourage you if you're looking for a good book on leadership that has the Bible weaved into it, especially the Gospels and Christ's example of leadership, I'd encourage you to pick up a copy of Lead Like Jesus. As we launch into this last week of Blanchard's book, I bringing you to Luke chapter 9 verses 1 through 6. I have verse 6 on the screen, but I want to set the context in the first 5 verses. Jesus has called his disciples together and he's given them power, he's given them authority, he has equipped them for the ministry, that they have power and authority over the demons and to cure diseases. He's also sent them out to preach the gospel and to heal the sick. Now, don't miss verse 1 and 2 of what Jesus has done. The disciples have followed Christ through the first 8 chapters of the gospel from when Christ called him into ministry. Christ just didn't send him out. He went and he set the example. The disciples got to see how Jesus interacted with the crowd. They got to see how Jesus taught. They got to see how Jesus preached. They got to see how Jesus healed. They got to see how Jesus left the crowds and he went away and prayed to the Father. So Jesus hasn't just talked about leadership, Jesus has demonstrated leadership to the disciples. And then the first 2 verses, he's given them and he's equipped them with the power and authority to go and to preach the gospel, to cast out demons, and to heal the sick. And then he says in verse 6, so they departed. Luke says they, the disciples, they departed. And they went through the towns and they preached the gospel. They practiced what they were learning from Jesus. Jesus set the example. Jesus had these discussions with them. Jesus went and showed them how ministry should be done. And what did they do? They went and they preached the gospel and they took that power, they took that authority, and they went and they preached and they healed everywhere. They followed the example of Christ. They followed what Jesus told them to do. But he first gave them the example. He showed them what to do. He talked about what to do. And then later on, when the disciples come back, they have a debriefing session to be able to be with Christ, to learn what they did, and to learn, if you will, what worked and what didn't. Jesus set a great example here of a leadership principle. Blanchard takes it in his book and he asks the question this way. He says, why should we lead like Jesus? Well, we should lead like Jesus because he was the greatest example of a leader that was ever there. He was the perfect leader. He was the Son of God. Now, you and I, we want to make sure we lead like Jesus, but don't expect that we're going to be perfect leaders. But we can read the Gospels and we can see all types of leadership aspects coming up through the life of Christ. So why do we want to lead like Jesus? Because he is the one that set the example. Jesus is it is us following the example of Jesus as the servant leader. How did Jesus demonstrate servant leadership? Jesus demonstrated servant leadership by John 13. He went and washed the disciples' feet. Instead of the disciples washing his feet because he was the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Son of God, the promised Messiah, Jesus didn't wait for people to serve him. Jesus went and served others. And it's another example in this concept of servant leadership, that we are not in leadership for people to serve us. We are in leadership to serve other people, to help bring people closer to the Lord, to help equip people into ministry so that the ministry and the gospel will continue to flow out of our church and the discipleship making will continue to happen in the church. So let's go back to Blanchard's quote here. It says, it is following the example of Jesus as servant leader and pouring your life into the lives of other people. As we look at the example of Jesus, he preached to thousands. But then he went and preaching to thousands. He took those 12 disciples and he pulled them aside and he told them what he was doing. He showed them why he was doing it. I'm thinking of when he went and talked in parables. He talked in parables to the crowds, but then he pulled the disciples aside and says, "Hey, come here, guys. This is what this means and this is how we apply it." He took those 12 and he ministered to those 12. But we've also learned out of those 12, he's taken three. Peter, James, and John, and they were his inner three. They were the core of who Christ really poured his life into. He spent even more time with those three. At the end of his life, whenever he was going to be betrayed and crucified, he took them and they were to pray with him as he went and prayed in the garden. So we see that Jesus spoke to thousands, ministered to 12, but had an inner crew or inner core of three men. And so it's really challenging for me as I read this quote and I say, hey, Jesus set the example of servant leadership and he poured his life into the lives of other people. It asks the question of me, who am I pouring my life into? Who am I using, or who am I using my leadership ability to? Who am I showing my leadership ability to? Who's getting a chance to learn how to preach? Who's getting a chance to learn how to lead? Who's getting a chance to learn how to counsel? Who's getting a chance on how to do ministry, how to do visitation, how to do in home communion? Who is getting these opportunities? Who am I pouring my life into? I would ask you the same question as you have leadership opportunities. Who are you teaching to take your spot? Who are you pouring your life into to help them understand how you do what you do? Because we're all going to take and we want to equip people for the ministry. We want to equip people for the works of service. And we want to be able to take what we know and pour into the lives of other people. So I ask myself that question because, first of all, it's what Jesus did. Jesus showed us that example. He poured into the lives of others. Yes, he ministered to many, many people, but he poured into the lives of 12. He specifically poured a lot of leadership principles into the life of those three men. Same question comes to you. Are you following the example of Jesus as a servant leader? How are you serving? How are you giving back? How are you equipping people? And who are you pouring your life into? Who are you helping to learn leadership principles? As I think about who's watching this, there's a lot of great leaders in our church, and we want to take and equip the next generation so that the gospel continues to go out. And we as leaders have a great opportunity to pull someone aside in a mentoring relationship and teach them, not so they can serve us, so that we have the opportunity to serve them. And because we want people to depart from us and we want them to go and reach our town and be able to minister to needs everywhere. I'm so thankful for your leadership. I'm so thankful for you watching. And I just trust that you will be challenged as we look at God's word and then we look at the example of Christ. Thanks so much for all you do. And I will see you next week for our next leadership principle.